Okay, great. We are going to move on to our second proposition. And while I introduce this proposition, please pick up your clickers and weigh in. Let us know what you think on this particular issue. This proposition is one I think that really has become quite contested in the China watching community, if you will. Because there's evidence pointing really in both directions. And like all of our propositions, there is no right or wrong answer. It's a matter of what your interpretation is and what your analysis is. And our proposition is Beijing is seeking to export the Chinese development model. And of course, I'm sure our speakers might even delve into what the term export means or what the term model means. But I think ultimately this is a really important question for the future, because it tells us something about whether or not the U.S.-China competition is going to be global. Because I think if the answer to this is yes, we are going to have a far more global competition than we have today. So President Xi Jinping, as we know, has pursued an ambitious agenda to advance Beijing's interests overseas. And in January 2013, Xi Jinping told the Central Committee that ultimately socialism will prevail over capitalism. And that speech was actually only made public earlier this year, even though it took place in 2013. And then in the 19th Party Congress in October 2017, Xi Jinping stated quite clearly the China model offers a new option for developing countries that want to accelerate their development while maintaining their independence. And then 2 months later, Xi Jinping told attendees at a forum of world political parties in Beijing that China will not export China's development model. So Xi Jinping has since reiterated that China will not impose its model on others, but he has continued also to say that it offers an option. And he has questioned the efficacy of Western-style development. So to debate whether Beijing is seeking to export its state-led model, I am joined here on the stage to my right by Elizabeth Economy, who is the C.V. Starr Senior Fellow and Director for Asian Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations, and also a visiting Distinguished Fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. And to my left is Dr. Wang Huiyao, who is founder and president of the Center for China and Globalization. And we're really glad to have both of them with us today to make the case both for and against this proposition. So hopefully I've given you all enough time to vote. Just over 100 people. I'm giving you another 15 seconds. Please weigh in. Press that button. Let me know what you think. We will vote again after the debate. We are now at 60, oh, keep going, 69%. We have 81 votes for the proposition, 31%, 37 votes against. Okay, so we had a few more register their votes, and I think now we will close the voting and we will get started. So 69% to 31%. Okay, so we will start with the case for the proposition. Liz Economy, over to you.
Also. Okay, there we go. Thanks, Bonnie. It's really a great pleasure to be here with you, with my friend Wang Huiyao, and with members of the audience to discuss and debate this issue of whether China seeks to export its model. Let me begin by taking you back to October of 2017 at the 19th Party Congress, as Bonnie mentioned, where Xi Jinping was reselected as General Secretary of the Communist Party for his second 5-year term. In his acceptance speech, he stated, "The China model for a better social governance system offers a new option for other countries and nations who want to speed up their development while preserving their independence. And it offers Chinese wisdom and a Chinese approach to solving the problems facing mankind." It was just a brief mention of a fairly vague concept in a major 3.5-hour speech. But as we have often observed, when Chinese leaders introduce new concepts, such as a new relationship among major powers or a community of shared destiny, we in the international community go on high alert. What does it mean, we ask? It must be important, we think. Round and round we go, but what does this idea really mean? No one seems to know. Beijing, for its part, pays close attention to our reaction, and if things start to go sideways, Chinese officials and the media stand ready to launch a counter-narrative. Nothing, they say. It means nothing. You are overreacting. And sure enough, as alarm bells went off in the West over the idea that China might try to propagate its model globally, Xi Jinping gave another speech, just 1 month later, in which he stated that China would neither import foreign models of development nor export the Chinese model and ask other countries to copy the Chinese practice. Yet the idea did not disappear. It merely went into hiding for a while. Gradually, new mentions of the idea popped up in articles by Chinese scholars and statements by Chinese officials. In July 2018, Huiyao, former foreign minister, for example, wrote, "The success of the Chinese model, which offers other developing countries an option different from the American model for economic development, has made the U.S. blind to China's remarkable contributions to the world and U.S. economies." Xi Jinping himself could not resist the opportunity to reintroduce the idea in a speech just 6 months after that, in December of 2018. He stated, "The Chinese nation, which since modern times had endured so much for so long, has achieved a tremendous transformation. It means that the path, the theory, the system, and the culture of socialism with Chinese characteristics have kept developing, blazing a new trail for other developing countries to achieve modernization." These statements were just the first indications that China was seeking to export its model. With a little bit of patience and a little bit of perseverance, we can begin to see the concept actually taking life. The contours and the content become clear, and concrete manifestations of the model's export emerge. For example, just last month, Zhejiang province hosted a forum called "The Significance of China's Social Governance to the World," which was attended by more than 200 experts from 20 countries. The Xinhua tagline from the conference was, "China can provide wisdom to a world that is in need of new governance models." And an article in the Beijing Review reported, "The world's largest developing country can truly offer wisdom to the governance of the world in many aspects, ranging from politics, economy, culture, science, education, public health, environment, and poverty reduction." So evidently there's a China model, and at least in the minds of China's leadership, it is eminently worth emulating. But what, you might reasonably ask, constitutes the China model? One can imagine many different elements to a China model, but I would agree with the International Monetary Fund and others that at its heart, the China model is a variant of authoritarian or state capitalism, a polity that is characterized by extensive state control over political and social life, including media, internet, and education, and whose economy reflects a mix of both market-based practices as well as the strong hand of the state in core sectors of the economy. In addition, China also exports many of the more distinctive elements of its model, such as a priority on infrastructure and export-led growth, and a strong commitment to sovereignty. So, to the meat of the argument, how does China seek to export its model? I would argue that there are 3 prongs to its approach. First, there's a concentrated and determined effort by the Chinese Communist Party to educate and train officials and experts on the nature of the model and on how to implement it. In some cases, the training takes place in China, in others, in the host country. Guangxi province, for example, is home to a beautiful new leadership academy established in 2017 under the direction of the Provincial Organization Department. Its mission is to train officials from ASEAN on China's governance and economic development model. The training program, which has reached about 500 ASEAN officials in its first 6 months, lasts about 10 days and includes subjects such as how the government can guide online public opinion, alleviate poverty, and develop a stronger grassroots presence. A number of scholars have also detailed more specific efforts by China to export its model to individual countries. My colleague Josh Kurlansik, for example, has documented the very granular export of the China model to Cambodia. Not only does China provide defense training for the army, economic training for ministers, and justice training for police, but there are also highly specific lessons on what tools to use to suppress dissent and how to encourage foreign investment while at the same time accessing and retaining foreign technology and skills. Stimson Center expert Yun Sun has similarly documented the intensive export of the China model to Africa. For example, the Chinese Communist Party is training the ruling Ethiopian leadership, specifically the Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Democratic Front, on how to develop its party organizational structure, ideological work, propaganda system, and cadre education. In addition, the CCP provides instruction on how to monitor, guide, and manage public opinion, including the organizational setup, technologies, legislation, and relations with the media. Delegates from the Sudanese People's Liberation Movement are also avid consumers of the China model. They travel to China annually for training on how to manage public opinion, build their party, and alleviate poverty. The head of the SPLM's Special Projects Department has discussed his plans to learn from China on how to develop a youth league modeled on China's Communist Youth League. On the political front, Beijing is particularly active in exporting the elements of its model dedicated to state control over civil society. It hosts 2 to 3 week seminars on how to conduct online censorship and surveillance for officials from other countries, such as the Philippines, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Thailand. After a joint China-Tanzanian roundtable on new media, the Tanzanian Deputy Minister of Communications, Edwin Nonyani, discussed collaborating with China on social media censorship, noting, "Our Chinese friends have managed to block such media in their country and replace them with homegrown sites that are safe, constructive, and popular. We aren't there yet, but while we are still using these platforms, we should guard against their misuse." Tanzania and Zimbabwe have both modeled their cybersecurity laws after that of China. And according to a study by the US-based think tank Freedom House, Vietnam has also released a cybersecurity law based on that of China after participating in a training seminar with Chinese officials. China, of course, is a full-service provider. In addition to offering the legal and institutional framework to enhance state control over society, it is also providing the technology to support it. In Uganda, for example, the Chinese government is providing technical support to monitor social media, and Huawei technicians reportedly recently helped Ugandan President Museveni intercept his opponent's Skype and WhatsApp communications after his own government team couldn't do it. China's National Electronics Import and Export Corporation is also building the capacity of Uganda's Communications Commission, police force, and Ministry of Internal Affairs. And at least 50 countries are developing Huawei-supported surveillance systems. While, of course, surveillance technologies can be important aids in reducing crime, it is also the case, as Latin America scholar Evan Ellis has noted, that these technologies will give authoritarian regimes something that they have only dreamed about: a massive ability to sanction persons who engage in political or social behaviors of which the government disapproves. China also exports economic elements of its development model. A senior official from the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean, for example, noted that China is teaching Latin America how to be a market economy while having the state organize and transform the productive structure. Indeed, both China's 1999 Go-Out strategy to acquire natural resources and its current Belt and Road Initiative in effect reflect the wholesale export of China's economic model, including massive state-led infrastructure projects, as well as plans for as many, for example, as many as 50 special economic zones in Africa, although fewer than 50 have come to fruition. Even the externalities of China's development model are replicated through its export. For example, China's economic development has been characterized by significant increases in infrastructure-induced government debt, a lack of transparency in deal-making, corruption, a failure to involve local populations in the decision-making and planning processes, and significant popular protest. All of these are now evident in Belt and Road countries where China is doing business. In some cases, the China model merely reinforces similar proclivities in Belt and Road countries. In others, it introduces fundamentally new challenges and opportunities. In all cases, however, China seeks to export its economic development model as part and parcel of how it does business and engages globally. The second prong of China's effort to export its model globally takes place at the level of international institutions and regimes. Xi Jinping speaks often of the need for China to lead in the reform of the global governance system. And in this case, China seeks to export the values and principles underpinning its model to bring international norms and practices more in line with those of China. Melanie Hart, scholar at the Center for American Progress, has brilliantly delineated Chinese efforts in this regard in international regimes around human rights and internet governance. As she notes, China seeks to push authoritarian principles and devalue universal values such as freedom, human rights, and democracy. It does so primarily by advocating for ideals such as cyber sovereignty or limitations on universal human rights in the name of national security and public order. It is worth noting, I think, that there is obvious complementarity between China's work helping to shape laws and regulations inside countries and its work at the level of global governance. These two prongs reinforce each other. China can develop a coterie of countries that shares its norms and values, and together they can shape international institutions and regimes in ways that reinforce those very same norms and values. Finally, the third prong of China's export strategy is both less obvious and more concerning. It differs fundamentally from the first two because the consumer does not actually want to buy what China is selling. In this case, the export of the China model relies on coercion to try to persuade actors in other countries to conform to the model. To be precise, China seeks to export the same state control over access to information and free speech that it practices at home to consumers abroad who would otherwise reject the China model. For example, in 2015, the Chinese government kidnapped several booksellers from Hong Kong, including a Swedish citizen, to pressure them to stop selling books critical of the Chinese government. More recently, this past October, we witnessed the case of the Houston Rockets general manager Daryl Morey, who tweeted, "Fight for freedom, stand with Hong Kong." China reacted to the tweet by canceling all Chinese licensing deals for Rockets merchandise and all CCTV broadcasts of NBA games. Of course, China has on many occasions attempted to use economic leverage to force countries, companies, and individuals to align their political statements and actions with those of China. What is particularly revealing in this instance, however, is not the effort to use economic leverage to pressure the Houston Rockets and the NBA, but rather the statement by state-owned CTV that any speech that challenges national sovereignty and social stability is not within the scope of freedom of speech. There could not be a clearer demonstration that China seeks to export its political model than a statement to the effect that China has the right to apply the same standards of free speech it practices at home to actors abroad. The idea that the People's Republic of China possesses a model that can serve as an example for other countries and is worth exporting is not new. In the 1960s, China promoted its revolution as a model for other third world countries, and Beijing offered political training and economic support to insurgents involved in national liberation movements. But it is not until now that the Chinese leadership once again seeks to export its model. Whether the export of this model is welcomed by others or not, whether it succeeds or fails, and whether we believe the impact to be benign or malign is immaterial. What is clear is that China's leaders believe that they have a model worth exporting and are seeking to do so. Thank you very much.
Okay, great. Speaking against the proposition, Huiyao, please.
Thank you, Bonnie, and also CSIS for invitation. And I remember last year we had, I was here also for the celebration of 40 years anniversary of U.S.-China diplomatic ties. And also thank Bonnie for visiting CCG in October in Beijing. And also I thank Elizabeth for her comments. And I also want to thank you for 2 years ago. I was speaking at the Council on Foreign Relations in New York. You were chair for me at that time. So it's great to be with such a very high-level audience here at the CSI. I never expected it was such a large crowd. Thank you for all coming. I think the topic today we're talking is Beijing is seeking to export the Chinese development model. I think this statement is not accurate. First, China never said it's going to export its export model, its development model. As a matter of fact, these days in China, you don't hear much about China development model anymore. It was not in any government or documents. You hear about China's path. You hear about the Chinese economy with Chinese market economy with Chinese characteristics, and so I think that is really the Chinese. China is not really seeking development export of the development model. So I was yesterday. I was in Beijing. I just came last night. I'm still under jet lag, but I was yesterday morning. I was with teams at the China European Chamber conference in Beijing, and then I was in the same panel with Tim Stratford, former assistant USTR, and also now the chairman of U.S. General Chamber in Beijing. And he was saying, that maybe now we should look at China in a different ways, that 和而不同, so we live together, but, work together, but with a different view. So I think probably that's the way we need to really seek to find the common problems, how we can tackle that. Of course, China also proposed that we should build a shared future of the mankind. So I think that probably is the right direction for China to go. So I think that there's quite a bit of misinterpretation of that, is that China, assuming China going to export its development model. But actually, the second point I want to make is that China's is really a miracle of the globalization development. Is actually its achievement of the mankind. You see, in the last 4 decades, actually, China developed open door policy 4 decades ago. That was exactly coincident with the U.S.-China diplomatic ties. And so you can see that China opened largely also to the United States. But in the last 4 decades, China rejoined the international governance system, which, the Bretton Woods system that was led by the U.S. So I think China and the U.S. actually contributed to the success of China's miracle. For example, in the last 4 decades, China's life expectancy has greatly improved, actually doubled for the last 7 decades. China became the second largest economy in the world, and contributing for the last 10, 15 years, 30% of the world GDP growth. And also China now is the largest trading nation for 130 countries, actually supporting a lot of countries' prosperity and development. And also, on China itself, 800 million people was lifted out of poverty. I mean, that was really often cited these days. I was at actually last month in Kazakhstan at the Astana club meeting. And in that meeting, one actually president of the former Eastern European bloc country president said, there's in the Middle East, there was only about a few million refugees. That has greatly distorted the world. I mean, the European, you see pre-exit, you see the yellow vest, you see the German bashing on immigrants and everything. So that actually distorted all this populism, also anti-globalization movement. Only a few million refugees. But he said, look, China has been able to lift 800 million people out of poverty. Just imagine if 10% of that 800 million, 80 million, become refugees. If they flooded Asia, if they flooded Japan, ASEAN, and then if they flooded Europe and the US, maybe we will be in disasters. We'll probably have so many terrorism and so much attacks. So we probably have to look at that in a different light. And also, China is getting more and more, it's not actually exporting its model, but it's getting more responsible. Like Robert Zoellick said, become a responsible stakeholder. For example, China now has already become the second largest donation to the United Nations now. China pays its due every year on time. And China now is also the largest peacekeeping force of permanent member, security member of the United Nations. And also, China is sending the world. For example, China has 150 million tourists touring around the world, spend $200 billion US dollars, with all the local business and supporting the growth of local business, and also China firmly support climate change, which is really responsible for that. And China, I mean, if you go to Beijing these days, it's 70% of the reduction of the pollution. You don't feel smoke there anymore. It's much better now. And you know what? Since 2001, China has, the world actually get 25% growth of the greenery was contributed by China, looking at it from satellite. China has been, planting all those greens and cultivate the environment. My third point is that China probably needs a better narrative. I think China is not good at telling stories. We should probably tell better, but basically is that, can we really peacefully live together in this world? China never colonized any country. China actually never provoked any military war in the last 7 decades. And so Professor Fukuyama said it's the end of history, when Berlin Wall was falling 30 years ago. But it's not, right? The history is not ending. We should really see a world have a different, way of life. We probably should really be living a colorful world. There's not only one form of governance in this country. We have a Chinese economy, socialist market economy with Chinese characteristic. We could have a U.S. capitalist market economy with American characteristic. We should have European capitalism with the market economy with European characteristics. So it's, every country, every continent must have a little uniqueness and difference. So we should not really converge to one model. The world is so colorful. How can we converge to one model? So we should allow really to have a colorful world like we have in the nature. So my fourth point is that we talk about Belt and Road these days a lot, but Belt and Road is, it's not a new concept. 2,000 years ago, when globalization started, the Silk Road is already there. It's the first, beginning of the globalization. So I think, the world really, since the financial crisis, 2008, the world needs some impetus, needs some new drive, needs some new investment. And China has benefited from its opening up for the last 4 decades. Multinational come to China, everyone invest in China. China benefit that. China built the fastest, speed train network in the world. The total length of the speed railway in China is equal to the next 10 countries combined. China has 5G, 4G, and out of the 60%, 70% of 5G stations are in China now. It's really developed with this 1.4 million big market. So for the Belt and Road, actually, according to the Belt and Road economy published by the World Bank, if BRI is fully implemented, the initiative could lift 32 million people out of moderate poverty, those who live less than $3.02 a day. It could boost the total global trade by up to 6.2% and up to 9.7% for the corridor economy. And the foreign investment, direct investment could also rise by as much as 6.7%. So that, you see, actually, Belt and Road is really something we needed. Further progress in BRI could also have a significant benefit for BRI participating economy, according to the IMF data and OECD calculation. China's export to BRI participating economy increased from 19% in 2000 to 34% in 2016. And also, according to many studies we have seen, actually, I was recently, just a month ago, in Greece, in Athens. I was attending the New York Times Athens Democracy Forum. But you see the Belt and Road project that China has on this Paris port created the employment for over 10,000 jobs for the local economy. And they built the Paris port into the largest port in the Mediterranean region and one of the fastest growing container terminals in the world, with its global ranking rising from 1903 in 2010, and after China is participating, at present, is already become 32. So you see, there's a lot of benefit there. And that's really what we can see, and for those good examples of a Belt and Road. And also there's one example, the Chinese company in Ethiopia set up a factory there to help Ethiopia produce half of its country's shoe export, employ 7,000 African workers there. Of course, Belt and Road is not perfect. It's still in its development stage and needs some improvement. So I think that China has AIB established. AIB has 100 member countries, and then out of the 100 countries, they have 6 presidents. China has 1, and there's 5 from other countries. India is the largest recipient of AIB loans. So I think AIB could work with World Bank, with ADB, AFDB, Inter-American Development Bank, European banks. Let's get all the development banks work together. And Belt and Road should be an international development project. So that we treat it like that. And also they were talking about debt trap of Belt and Road. But actually, according to Rodian's group, they studied the 40 different cases for the last decade of all Chinese big loan projects. Out of that, only very few, probably 1 or 2 of the projects like that. Majority of them actually was carried out okay. Either the loan was paid or re-extended or forgiven. So I think we have to look at it a different light. Finally, I would like to say that U.S. and China should really work together. It's really we are the 2 largest economies in the world. We should be really responsible for the well-being and also the development of the world. Also, U.S.-China cannot be decoupled. For example, these days, GM and Ford sells more cars in China than United States. Walmart purchases 20-30% of its product from China to supply all the Walmart in the U.S. Costco just recently opened a supermarket in China. It's flooded by the Chinese. China has 400 million middle class. In the next 10, 15 years, could be 800 million. So if we, like Qualcomm has 65% of its business out of China. So if we really, contain China or stop China's development, we're really killing the, golden goose that lay golden eggs. So I think, it's really we have to think how we can work together. I think the problem we're having today is really China is taking all the blames. For example, here in the United States, 1% of the Wall Street, the wealth of that is larger than the 90% of the population here. So it's really, global governance is falling behind global practice. So we have to think about how we can really better work together and with all the China, US, and the rest of the world. So I think there's many things we can really work together. I really admire Professor Economy's work. I mean, she wrote many books. I really like her concept of that China and the US should have a smart competition rather than we are, faces each other as a strategic rivalry. I think smart competition is good. We have so many areas to collaborate. We could cooperate on the drug trafficking. China has just recently sentenced some people for smuggling fentanyl, and a very harsh, severe punishment, lifetime in prison. And also, we should cooperate more on the counterterrorism. We should cooperate more on the clean energy. We should fight Ebola in Africa. China and the US have so much in common. There's about 500,000 Chinese students in the United States. There's 3 million tourists from China to the United States. There could be more. So there's only less than 10,000 US students in China. We really welcome more US people come to China and see China, and then really we exchange. Rather than we really getting this downward spiral of the negative sentiment. I mean, the world is going, we can't afford to have a military conflict. I mean, we see Taiwan and all those issues. It cannot. If we have that, we will be destroyed many times over. The only thing that we have been survived peacefully in the last 75 years since the World War is we have the trade, we have the economic activities, we have the prosperity. So actually we have deglobalization. We have people that left behind. Let's work together to lift them. Just like China, we lifted 800 million people out of poverty, and then by 2020, there will be no poverty in China. So that's a huge achievement. If China can contribute to the world, if China can really support the world economy and become a locomotive and support 30% of the world GDP growth, let China support the 40%. Let China be really a good thing for the world. So let's think in good terms rather than a negative thing. The world is not half empty, it's half full. So I'm really optimistic, and I hope that we really have this working together for the US and China and for the human being of mankind. Thank you very much.
Okay, here's where you get a chance to respond to each other and compel each other to sharpen your arguments. And Liz, why don't you respond to Wang Huiyao?
Okay, so thanks, Huiyao, for those really, I think, worthwhile remarks, stressing the importance of U.S.-China cooperation. I couldn't agree with you more. I'm not sure that you precisely addressed the issue at hand about the export of the China model, except maybe in the very beginning when you said nobody's talking about it anymore. So maybe I'll just respond to that. By saying I actually participated in a conference in Beijing just last month that was all about basically the China model. And so I think there is a lot of discussion still going on about it. I think there's some discussion about what it might include. This happened to be a conference that took place at Institute of Socialism within the Academy of Culture. And so their focus was on China as a model sort of that included things like eco-civilization and meritocracy and other elements of a China model. But I think there's still a lot of discussion about China model and its relevance for the rest of the world. And I would also point to Xi Jinping's speech just in September of this year in 2019, where he also reiterated that China's creation, a miracle of rapid economic development, long-term social stability, provides a new option for developing countries to modernize and contributes to China's wisdom and Chinese solutions for human beings to explore and build a better social system. The quotation is longer, but it's basically the same thing that he said a couple of times before. So I think that there still is this element of wanting the rest of the world to acknowledge a China model and to export elements of it. So why, maybe just I could say why I think China might be interested in exporting its model. I think there are a couple of reasons. First, because it helps develop a group of supporters to protect China when China comes under criticism in the international system. So, for example, we saw not so long ago, just this past summer, when I think it was 22 countries sought to censure China for what was going on in Xinjiang, right, mostly Western Europe, United States, the developed economies in Asia, that China managed to rally 37 countries, or more even, to say actually China's doing a fine job of human rights practices. And so I think there's an element there whereby, it's exporting its model, working with other authoritarian states, it can develop, as I said, a coterie of countries that help support it and protect it. I also think it's useful in terms of a narrative for the Chinese people themselves, right? So that China does not stand alone as a single sort of, I use this word, just not in a pejorative sense, but a pariah state, right? It's not unique. There are many countries that are embracing a China model, and I think that's a positive message that Beijing can transmit to its own people, right? If other countries are using elements of a Chinese political and economic development model. And then finally, as I did mention in my earlier remarks, I think it does provide for ease of business, right? So when China is dealing with countries that share similar elements of its political and economic development model, it is just easier for China to get business done, right? They don't have to do environmental and social impact assessments. If there's a kind of lack of transparency in the overall structuring of the deal, all these things just make it easier to get the deals done. So I'll stop there. Welcome your comments.
Great. So, Huiyao, China's a miracle of globalization. U.S.-China cooperation is important. But convince us why you think Beijing is not seeking to export this development model that's worked so well for it.
Yeah, I actually partly agree with what Liz just said. Actually, that's right. There are some people in China actually do talk about China models and China, whether that can replicate it and things like that. But it's not really become a party line. I don't think that Chinese government is really endorsed, oh, we are having a Chinese model that we should really apply to the rest of the world. You don't see that, in people's daily or anything like that. Probably in some, academic discussion you have that, but I don't think it's a really mainstream that Chinese government certainly denies that, I think. But also I can understand why some academics talk about that. Because Chinese system, it's different from the rest of the world somehow, with 5,000 years history, with all those development in the last 4 decades. But China is also gradually, they build up their confidence because they see, one of the examples is that recently they finished the fourth plenary of 19th Party Congress. And in that communique, they said China basically managed to achieve 2 miracles. One is that the longest growth of the economy of the size of China for the last 4 decades. That's incredible. That's probably the longest. And China is managing to do that. The second is also China managed to maintain the stability. It's so important to maintain stability for the largest country with so many ethnic people, with the populist 1.4 billion people in a country as large, as complex as China. And then, given what's going on in the world, you see what happened in the Middle East, what happened in the Brexit, we see Yellow Vest, we see all the things happening, Spain, Chile, and even Hong Kong. You probably would celebrate. China has been working one 5-year plan after another 5-year plan. And China, I have a series. China is actually monitored by 100 or 200 countries in this world. It's about the media, thousands of NGOs, media, and the UN system, China, so they're taking all the criticism, and then they try to perfect their system. I think what China wants is they want some recognition. That's right. They want some people, maybe less view China in a really traditional lens. Maybe see China, well, this may be a new way of doing things, maybe a new way of life. And if that really working well for the Chinese people, and then maybe, and also generate a contribution to the world, we should probably let them try. And just like Fukuyama said, it's not the end of the history. We may have another form of history developing. So what I'm proposing is that let's have the peaceful, like what Elizabeth said, smart competition rather than view each other as an enemy. We have to wipe you out. That's not good. China never, U.S. has big military troops in Japan. in Korea, surrounding China, Afghanistan, whatever. China never have any soldier, in North America. But let's really face it. China peaceful rise is a good thing for the world. Of course, China needs to be improved. China has a lot of way to learn. China wants to join WTO. Also safeguard the multilateral system. China even wants to join CPTPP and conclude RCEP and things like that. So I think there's many ways China can improve, but let's give China a chance and have a great way to let this big country have a little different system. We don't want to try to converge them. If they join WTO, if they don't converge, if they don't like one of us, we should really fight them. No. If they don't like that, that's the diversity of the world. If they're doing well, maybe something useful for the other countries. China didn't propose to let people to export, but if people want to say, okay, some of the things China is doing well, maybe like education, respect families, and all those things. So there could be exchanges. So my point is that let's have some diversity for the world rather than just one Western model of democracy, right?
The world is a rainbow of colors. We now are going to turn to all of you to ask some tough questions. If you can't see me, I can't see you, and that means that you'll have to stand up if you want to be recognized. And please, again, wait for the microphone, identify yourself, and please ask a question. Okay, so let's start all the way in the back, over there. Please wait.
Hello, my name is Drake Long. I'm a graduate student working on maritime security over at Georgetown. There's a lot of concern about, and I hope this is in the purview of this discussion, there's a lot of concern about China's influence in bodies like the International Seabed Authority and the UN FAO. So my question very succinctly is, how does China seek to impact global governance?
Okay, we'll take two questions at a time. That was, how does China seek to impact global governance? And let's go to the front table here. It's Naomi, right?
Hello, my name is Piper Campbell, former Foreign Service officer. I have a question for both Dr. Wang and Dr. Economy. Dr. Wang, I heard you say that Chinese officials are not advocating a Chinese development model, but they are advocating the Chinese path. And I'd like to understand from your perspective, what's the difference? What are the key differences between advocating a model and advocating a path? And Dr. Economy, my question is, if we accept the proposition that China is seeking to export a development model, what's the big therefore? What's the significance of that, especially from a U.S. perspective?
Okay, why don't we start with you, Henry?
Okay.
In Chinese, that's actually an interesting question about development path, because
Okay.
in Chinese, of course, the phrase is really a road, development road or development path. They don't use the term model, so it's an interesting question.
Okay, I answer this lady's question first. And what actually, I think there's a quite huge difference. A model means, it can be replicated, can be repeated, should be learned from, or can be serve as a good example. China never said that. China said path, basically for itself, for its own people, that, the path that they can take, if they, just like Deng Xiaoping said, crossing the river by touching the stone. If they really, like also Deng Xiaoping said, it doesn't matter as white cat and black cat as long as it catches mice. So if they really work this way, they find that it's really a test and area that tried well, then they may want to continue that path. Doesn't mean that they're going to impose this path to anybody else. So I think that when China says Chinese path, it really says, if we take the right path, maybe we'll continue that and avoid the zigzags on that. So that's my question. Second, regarding the global governance, I think China can do. China, I think it's good that for example, China now still, on some of the things, still in the same line with Western countries and the international community. For example, for the multilateralism, so many countries really wants multilateralism. In this world, we cannot live individually. We cannot, unilateralism never worked. If we all go back to the primitive days, let's go back 75 years ago. Every country does its own. Like World Bank has just released the report, last month. World Bank's, the Global Value Chain report last month said, 80% of the production today is really 80% made by different countries. For example, all the U.S. export to the Chinese export to the United States, half of them are made by U.S. companies. President Trump is really hurting U.S. economy by imposing a tariff. And then, in the 70s and 80s, 80% was the product, the country of origin. It's made by a single country. But so now it may be made in China, but it's really made by the world. So what I'm saying, China is now supporting globalization, supporting WTO. I was in Geneva for the WTO Public Forum just also months ago. For example, China is also trying to initiate this anti-plastic ban. So that I think piecemeal, many things like e-commerce, many things that China can do. China also trying to work on this RCEP, and maybe we encourage China to join CPTPP. So all those multilateralism, China can work together with U.S. and with many other countries.
Thanks. So to the first question about China's impact in global governance and regimes and institutions, I think it's mixed. As Wang Huiyao has detailed, there are ways in which China can be supportive of international regimes and basic principles that underpin the liberal international order. For example, the establishment of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, I think, is a good example of where China's efforts have been additive to the international system. In contrast, you could look at its efforts not too long ago to hold up funding for the UN's mission to Afghanistan because the United States and the other countries refused to have language about the Belt and Road Initiative inserted in the formal documents. And so there was a big holdup around that particular issue. Is something quite important, right? The funding for this entire mission, because China wanted to have its language about BRI being UN supported, basically to have it be part of a formal, document out of the UN with regard to Afghanistan. So I think that's a negative one. And then I think you can look at areas that I mentioned before about human rights and cyber governance, and internet governance, where I think fundamentally China takes a different, state-centered approach, doesn't recognize inalienable rights in the same way that the United States and other Western democracies do. And I think those are areas where we're going to find ourselves in conflict with China. We do find ourselves in conflict with China today, and I think also moving forward. In terms of the significance of China's export of its model and to the extent that it gains adherence for its elements of its model, I think, look, many of the elements that I described, I think, in my remarks really run counter to the fundamental principles of the United States and other liberal democracies. So, talk about things like freedom of navigation or, free flow of capital, free flow of information, right? All of those things are not necessarily in the purview of the China model. And so, as we are looking to promote those ideals that we support, again, to the extent that China develops adherence, we will find it more and more difficult for us to pursue our interests, to put it frankly. Right? So cyber sovereignty, internet sovereignty runs against principles of the free flow of information that the United States supports. And I would just make the point on the globalization issue, because I know that this is an area of expertise for Wang Huiyao. I do think it's hard sometimes to make the case that China is a champion of globalization when it doesn't support the free flow of information and the free flow of capital. So, maybe it's globalization with Chinese characteristics, but I think sometimes, we have to take a term for what it really is. I just put that as, I put that out there.
All right, we're going to take a few more questions, all the way over there.
Hi, good morning. I'm Michele Savini from the Peterson.
Speak a little louder, please.
Can you hear me now? So I'm Michele Savini from the Bank of Italy, temporarily at the Peterson. I have a question for both, I guess. I was wondering, what role do you see for the Chinese currency and payment platforms in the export of the Chinese model? Thank you.
Something about currency platforms, I didn't quite get it. Can you repeat the question?
Sure. I was wondering, what role do you see for the Chinese currency and Chinese payment platforms in the internationalization?
What role does the Chinese currency play? Okay. All right, and we'll take another question from over here.
Hi, Jonathan Marshall at the British Embassy. Question to Dr. Economy. You talked a lot about the concerns of the Chinese development model for countries to meet their infrastructure needs. What advice would you give to US and other countries' policymakers in offering alternatives?
Yeah, I think that right now we are really living in an intertwined world. For example, we know that 95, probably 98% of the world trade is conducted in US dollars. And we're all using the SWIFT system that largely managed by the US. So that system, everything works fine. But then if we really have this trade tariff and this trade war going on, and then if we really want to decouple, it's really, not a good sign. So that probably will force China into develop some kind of separate system. So RMB internationalization is probably, on the agenda. But sometimes I think the U.S. sanction on the trade war has accelerated that. So with many other things like Huawei thing as well. So if we don't using the 5G, the most advanced technology, that developed by Huawei. For example, also you were talking about alternative of Nokia and Ericsson equipment of Huawei. They also made in China. So does that mean also if any advanced thing made by China is all under national security concern? Should China, ride on the GM and Ford car? Should China refuse to buy Boeing airplanes? I mean, that's going to be getting into really ridiculous things. So I think, we have to really get rid of this mistrust and really trying to work together. So I think the currency is the same. US dollar is fine. I mean, China has the largest reserve of that. But should we, really think of we should design our own system and I mean, that's happened. China, Russia now they have something on RMB now. So, but I think U.S. has a lot of advantages. We should keep that, but not really using the trade war to do that.
Okay, so on the currency issue, I think, the U.S. and other countries have been waiting for China to allow its currency to float freely, right? I think there's been a lot of hope over the years, right, that with greater financial reform, reform in the financial sector, that this would proceed. It hasn't come to pass, but I think China's view now is that in good measure it can use the Belt and Road Initiative in part to try to do trade settlements more and more using the renminbi. It hasn't quite hasn't turned out that way necessarily. So I think one of the surprises over the past several years has been, despite the fact that China has had a big push to use the renminbi for trade settlements, it really, you don't see the renminbi increasing significantly in terms of the percentage of trade settlement globally. It did take a dip, as Bonnie just mentioned. I don't know where it is right now compared to last year, but it's quite low. So I think it's part of the overall idea, certainly in the Belt and Road, the construction of the Belt and Road, to have the renminbi become internationalized through that process, but doesn't seem necessarily to be working as rapidly as Beijing would like. In terms of what recommendations for countries that want infrastructure, and by the way, is anybody else out there providing it or going to help in any way? Look, I think when the Belt and Road Initiative was first announced, and actually not when it was first announced, but let's say date it since the beginning of the Trump administration, you had Secretary Tillerson going out there talking about debt trap diplomacy and, raising a big stink. And frankly, it was, at that point in time, a little bit embarrassing because there was no alternative. So it's a little bit like saying, don't take this assistance from China, but by the way, we don't have anything to offer. I think things have changed a little bit since then, and now you're seeing much more effort by the United States. Australia, Japan have an infrastructure partnership that was established, I want to say in 2018. We have the Blue Dot Initiative now, which is with the same countries designed to provide assistance to countries to understand sort of the full parameters of the type of investment that they should take perhaps. And so I think there's now, we established a new agency in the United States, the International Development Finance Corporation, IDFC, to support infrastructure investment globally, not just for U.S. firms, but can be tapped into by other multinationals as well. So I think there's a lot going on. And, Wall Street Journal had a piece saying that Japan is the largest source of infrastructure investment, for example, in Southeast Asia. It's not China. So I think, the international community was quick, and the United States in particular was, quick to condemn and complain about Belt and Road. But I think gradually the response now is more positive, and frankly, more competition is better. Right? So to the extent you have more countries out there sort of offering high-quality infrastructure investment, to the extent that that contributes to, get China to raise its game, perhaps, in some elements of transparency and, best practices, I think it's all to the better. And Europe should get in the game as well.
Okay, 2 more questions. The gentleman standing at the door.
Thank you. Steve Winters, independent consultant. I think I'd direct this to Elizabeth. Actually, Ezra Vogel spoke here in Washington, D.C. Recently, and he went into some detail with the thesis that the Chinese actually were tutored and borrowed their development model from the Japanese back in the early period of Deng's reforms. Chalmers Johnson, in his later writings, makes the same point. And I'm so old, I can remember all the writings in the 80s, for instance, James Fallows, which talked about a different Asian development model. And first you had the Japanese, and you had the Four Tigers, and now we have China. So even if China weren't there at all, you would still have this development model. That's the question. And people could still copy it, and China is just the most outstanding example on a mega scale of something which is a model not the same as what we practice in U.S. economy.
So
Wait, we're going to take one more question. That's all right. But the question there was, do you agree with that, I think? Okay, we'll take this gentleman up front, and then we'll come back to our panelists.
Hi, thank you very much for your comments. My name is Steve Andrews with the Congressional Executive Commission on China. My comments primarily directed towards Dr. Wang. You made the comment that China's not very good at telling stories, and then you made the point that there should be more cooperation on counterterrorism. So I'd like you to address specifically the point that Dr. Economy raised regarding now the arbitrary detention of over 1 million Uyghurs and other ethnic minorities in Xinjiang, and how there could be any cooperation given this arbitrary detention. Thank you.
Or maybe you could link that to the development model in some way. Okay, Liz?
Okay, so sure, I think Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, all those countries began authoritarian states and, a strong degree of state involvement in economic development. But I think what we're talking about now in terms of in the context of the current China model embraces much more than simply that element of the economic development model, right? Just infrastructure-led growth and exports. It also embraces all the political elements that I was discussing, right? The controls over the internet and exports of elements like that were not present from Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan. There wasn't that export of, politics from those countries globally in the same way that I think we're seeing China do today. So I think it's a different concept now.
Thank you for your question. I think regarding the Japan model you mentioned, I think there's some similarity in the East Asian culture and Confucius society, and so China, probably also some replication of that. But also on the other hand, I think the Oriental culture also stress more on the collectivism, and also hardship, work ethic, and also respect family, authorities, and things like that. But I even think, China probably is a large Singapore, for example. I mean, also Japan is always one party. Liberal Party is always in power. I mean, Singapore is that. So if you don't take Chinese party in face value, I mean, they really become a very pragmatic party that every 5 years plan after another 5 years plan to really make the country focus on one direction. But then they take in criticism from around the world. There's hundreds of opposition parties, watch them out. So it's not like old days, the emperor is high, and emperor is, mountain is high, emperor is far away. They are isolated. They are well informed. So I think that they can make right decisions. And then so that they can really, the country can really go very well. So I think that China deserves a good chance to look at the development path. Regarding what this friend was asking about Xinjiang, I'm not an expert on that, but from what I know, is that several years ago, we were seeing the news. There was a lot of terrorism. People having knives, shootings, and everywhere in Xinjiang, hundreds or even people being killed. I mean, it was terrifying. Nobody's going there. The economy is collapsing. But since I think China now is trying to some development education centers. So these education centers, that maybe it may not be perfect. I don't think it's really they are also experiment that. But what the result is that it's really there's no more a single accident of a terrorism attack. The economy is picking up, tourism is picking up. I mean, Elizabeth just mentioned, there was 50, 60 Muslim countries, including the United Nations, many other countries, went to Xinjiang and see that, a lot of people graduating, they went through the education center, vocational center, they got graduated, and then, the society is really peaceful. I mean, it may be right or wrong. It's hard to say on those kind of methodology, but I think it's an experiment that really worked, I think, for Xinjiang, and then deserved had some international recognition as well. But of course, I mean, it could do better, I suppose, giving all the experience they have. But I think instead of you have a terrorism attack every day, I mean, also like we don't want a mass shooting happening every day, and things like that. So it's really not an ideal way to handle that. But I think with the international criticism, China has realized that. China has also improved that, and a lot of people graduating, and then Xinjiang is now taking off. All the tourism coming back, economy is booming, and all the international visitors are welcome. So I think there's also a lot of over miss on that issue as well.
All right, we're going to take one last question. I'm going to ask you all to please make sure that your questions are connected to the proposition. Yes.
Thank you. Michael Trek Kim. So how should the U.S. address the political elements, Dr. Economy, that you just mentioned, of China's international economic policy and its diplomacies? And what does the U.S. need to understand now to successfully engage and persuade China on these elements and other grievances? Thank you.
Okay, thanks. So a little bit two-part question, it seems to me. I think in terms of what the United States needs to do, we have the free and open Indo-Pacific concept, which is, as far as I'm concerned, largely a, pivot rebalance 2.0, but fundamentally rooted in U.S. values. And I think we need to get more deeply engaged in the effort of political capacity building, since you raised the issue of politics, because that is, the counter to exporting, the surveillance systems, exporting, China's cybersecurity laws is getting in there and exporting, not just the US, but Japan and Australia. I mean, I think one of the great strengths that we have is that it's not all about the United States. And in many respects, I think we do ourselves a disservice when we frame everything as a US-China competition. It's not a competition between the United States and China. It's a competition at some level between different sets of values. And to that end, I think we should be working with all of our allies and partners to help develop institutions, values, and norms in other countries that are still developing that reflect our institutions and values and norms, as opposed to allowing China to do that work. In terms of how we persuade China, I think, I am someone who believes that engagement had a profound effect in China, and not someone who thinks that engagement didn't work. In the area that I worked on, in the environment, I watched for 20 years the impact of U.S. and European, Canadian engagement with China in terms of developing laws and civil society, and it's been extraordinary, right? The funding from the international community to support Chinese environmental sort of development, really transformative. I think that challenge now is this is a fundamentally different China under Xi Jinping. There's much less interest in having that kind of cooperation. Wang Huiyao's institute notwithstanding, he is all about that kind of cooperation, but opportunities are clearly far more limited, right? The number of foreign NGOs in China has dropped from over 7,000 to about 600 because of the new NGO law. There's much less interest, I think, possibly with some merit in China in thinking about a U.S. model, about being interested in emulating the United States. That's the whole proposition here, right? That China believes it has its own model, right? And its own model is worth exporting. So I think it's far more difficult. But the way to do it is what we were talking about before, by bringing competition to the table, right, across the board, multilateralizing it, and hopefully forcing China to up its game, right, in areas like infrastructure investment, bringing transparency to the process, bringing environmental and social impacts into the process. Those are all wins. May not be the greatest win that we would like, but at least it's a start.
Okay, final comments, Huiyao?
Yeah, thank you. Regarding the question about how US-China can work together, it reminds me just about 2 weeks ago, I was in Beijing and attended the Bloomberg, this New Economy Conference. We had a really inaugural roundtable on that, was there, and then we had all former 3 USTR, Charlene Bashevsky and Susan Schwab and Michael Forum and Kevin Rod and all the people there. And I would talk about what can be done to really get China and the US working together, including the trade war. And the conclusion we had is just one headline they summarized. It's called TPP Goes Global. Doors open for China and the US to join. So I think that this multilateral approach is good, and that we should, US and China should work together, and then to really be an active support of the multilateralism. China should even be invited to join G7. It's ironic, G7 was not, not including China. So G20, of course, China is there. But I think, we need more venues and more platform to engage China and let China play a responsive, active role. And I think US and China have a great future by working together. Thank you.
Okay, now we're going to go back to our vote. And if your clickers have turned off, please turn them back on, because apparently they do automatically turn off. And you'll be able to see that the light is on if your clicker is working. So I guess we all agree that the US and China should cooperate, but we're voting on the proposition Beijing is seeking to export the Chinese development model. And I'm going to give you a minute to please register your votes. And we started with 69% that agreed with the affirmative, that Beijing is seeking to export the Chinese development model, and we had 31% that was opposed. And I think so far, the number of people who think Beijing is seeking to export its development model is increased. I can't read that. 82, okay. We have over 125 votes that are registered. Anybody else want to weigh in? Please add your...
Let's stop now.
Should we stop? Oh, yes. That's all right. Keep the votes coming. We'll give you another 10 seconds. Or if you want to change your vote, you can change it, right? Either direction. I am always objective, so I never weigh in on one side or the other.
No, in fact, you wrote a piece saying that it's not exporting its development model, which I read in advance of this.
Well, that looks like an interesting split. Okay, so we will close it there. It's 80% to 20%. So Liz, you have increased the number of people who support the fact that Beijing is seeking to export the development model. But we are going to have to continue to watch this as we go forward because there will be more data in the future to see.
It's going to get me up to 90%.
It's going to get you up to 90%. We are not going to take a break. We will have one more proposition before lunch, but first, please join me in thanking Elizabeth Economy and Wang Huiyao. Thank you so much. It was great. So if I can ask our two speakers to come up for our proposition about technology. Please, I'll just keep my water, that's okay.